Hello and welcome to our second session of the Beginning Racer webinar. Last week we did an introduction of some of the basics, and this week we'll be expanding upon those and applying them to cornering, sprinting, and navigating or moving through the field. A couple quick notes though for this session is that we're going to be talking about just one approach on how to ride within a group. And so there are other ways to do this in certain groups or certain contexts. There are going to be some other techniques to use, but these tend to be some good conservative, safe approaches to riding in a group, making sure you're safe, making sure you can ride cooperatively and efficiently with others. But just be aware, you're going to run into other groups who do it a little bit different way, and hopefully this will provide you a basis for understanding what's going on in the group, as well as recognizing if something different is happening. And then the second part of that is also, there are multiple approaches, but in general, try and keep some of these basics in mind and recognize that you shouldn't break these rules unless you know why. And sometimes that's because a different group has different norms for how they do it. But sometimes it's also, if you're not sure why, it's probably best to just go with the conservative route. And the last thing I want to point out is, if we're looking at this chart here, we're really just focusing in this webinar on becoming aware of what some of the basics are for riding in a group, whether you're in a pace line or cornering, sprinting, etc. But take some time. There are lots of videos out there. Watch some of those, observe what's going on in a group. Lots of people are going to narrate those videos, and so you can learn a lot more. But you'll be able to start to recognize some of the things that are happening. And so we'll talk about some details and some skills to employ, and also things not to employ. And you'll be able to recognize those in a lot of videos. Even at the elite level, you're going to see some of those things. In that context, some of them might be okay, but you also might question why are they doing that in that setting when maybe that wasn't a great idea to begin with. And sometimes they have good reasons for doing that, and sometimes they don't. And as you get more complicated, you do some analysis of what they're doing. And obviously, we'd love to be doing the Beginning Racer program on the road, practicing some of these skills. But when you get the opportunity, practice some drills and some controlled scenarios with people. And then also just go and do the skills when you're in group riding with other people. But all these things take a lot of practice. One is the kind of just learning and understanding side, and the other side is doing it. Ultimately, you want to get down here where these things are starting to become habits. And then ultimately, once these are things you can perform without really thinking about it or focusing on it at all, you also learn how to improvise on those. But the whole thing is, it's a long process. It takes some practice and experience. So we're going to start here with awareness, and I want you to be aware that it's going to take practice to move along. So take every opportunity you can to learn along the way. So quick recap of some of the basics, because we're really going to apply these a lot today. Position on the bike, heads up and eyes looking forward, 5 to 10 riders, really a key thing. It's just staying safe, but also for using these skills in a group when you're cornering and sprinting and other things. Protecting your front wheel. Just imagine there's kind of a bubble or circle around your front wheel, and you want to make sure that there's nothing in there that's going to be a danger to you, particularly other riders. If you're overlapping half wheel, typically the person behind is the one who's in danger, not the one in front. And so it's always your responsibility to protect your front wheel. The person in front of you should be predictable as we get into the next key of group riding. And so they don't want to be making sudden movements that are necessarily going to cut you off, but at the same time, it's your responsibility to protect your front wheel, not their responsibility. They should be riding predictably, but you've got to manage your own front wheel. And then predictability has a couple parts. One is just managing the space around you. So moving right and left, are you doing that in a smooth, predictable way? Or maybe in lots of circumstances, just not moving right and left. So you're not kind of weaving down the road. And then also controlling how fast you accelerate as well as how quickly you stop. Generally, we say the less brakes, the better, because you don't want to be making sudden changes in speed. And that can go for accelerating because it makes it harder for others to follow you, which if you're trying to ride together, you don't want. But you also don't want to be slamming on the brakes and obviously have people come rolling up right into you. The second part of being predictable, though, is just following a line. And sometimes that's a straight line, but sometimes that's also just a curved path. But if you're basically following the rider in front of you or paying attention to the general path of all the riders in front of you gives you a really good key of where you're going, even if that's not a straight line down the road. And then also communicate. Sometimes you're going to see things happening that may not be what you expect, and if you just ask questions or communicate about those, it's going to help a lot. And then keeping perspective through it all. Everybody's in it together. Not overreacting is actually quite key to a lot of things in a group, and recognizing that your actions affect others, and you're hoping that others also recognize their actions are going to affect you. As we get into how do you maneuver through a group, you really want to keep in mind how you can be assertive but not aggressive nor passive. You don't want to let everybody in, everybody past. That doesn't actually do very much, number one, to help you keep position if you're in a race, nor just to be safe, because you're just kind of letting everything happen. You also don't want to force yourself into situations to be aggressive. In race context, there are situations where people start getting more aggressive, and at the elite level, that can happen. But as you're learning, try and avoid that. It's not going to be helpful. And then, as I touched on just a little bit ago, it is a process of learning, practicing, improving, and that's going to go on over and over and over. And so keep in mind that you're not going to start out being perfect in any of these, but take opportunities to learn and improve. So let's start applying these basics to cornering. Now, when we talked about pace lines, and if you haven't seen session 1, definitely go back, take a look at that. We talk more in detail about pace lines and some of those basics as you're just starting to ride in a group, and so you're understanding those. But we talked about how a person is at the front pulling, and then how they rotate off, how they do that smoothly, predictably, how you change speed with those things. And then getting back on the back, anticipating. We talked about consistent spacing, so you're not having gaps open up. You're keeping your speed steady, both in terms of not accelerating super hard and fast, nor slowing down, braking hard. And so that helps keep the spacing and gaps between everybody really smooth. And then whether you're changing lines in the group or making any speed changes, those are all gradual. And those are all going to apply in cornering. But the first bullet doesn't really apply to cornering so much. As you're going through corners, obviously you can be sitting on the front pulling, but we're not going to have those rotations off the back. You're not going to be jumping back on the front. Those are things that even at the elite level can be frowned upon in terms of changing lines in the corner, even if it's kind of smooth and gradual and predictable. That's one that is different in cornering than it is from just riding a pace line straight down the road. But things that definitely apply and that we see and really trying to emphasize as you're learning to corner with other riders in a group is consistent spacing. So one of the things that can happen is people are naturally going to kind of stop pedaling, coast through a corner. If people aren't confident or kind of taking an assertive approach to a corner, they might even be braking and slowing down. And that can open up some big gaps in the group. So one of the things we really focus on with consistent spacing is making sure that speed stays really even. And then gradual, predictable changes. If you're changing the gaps between riders, if you're making any changes, those need to be particularly gradual and steady and smooth in a corner, because pretty much you just want to follow the line of the rider in front of you. Now, as we look at going around a corner, it's helpful to think about what path you take through the corner. Just like in a pace line, we say follow the rider in front of you. And at the simplest level, cornering in a group is as simple as just following the line of the rider in front of you. But it helps to know what a good path through the corner is. So if you're driving down the road and you're going to stay on one side of the road and you're going to come up that side of the road, whether you got to pause or not, you're going to come around the corner and you're going to stay on that same side of the road. Works great for driving, keeps things nice and organized, but it is not necessarily the fastest way around the corner. Most of the time when we're driving, that's not our goal, is to get around the corner the fastest. But if we're racing, we do want to try and take a fast corner. And so how we get around that corner is going to look quite a bit different. First of all, we want to make sure that we're setting up over here on the right side of the road. We don't want to be drifting as we approach the corner toward the middle of the road, or especially toward the inside, because that gives us a lot smaller radius to make the turn. And ultimately, you can't go around the corners as quickly. When we hit the middle of the corner or the apex of the corner, you want to be on the inside of the corner, real close to that inside curb, and then that gives you lots of space coming out to come all the way out to the outer side if you need it, depending on how tight that turn is, how fast you're going, or how fast the group is going. As I alluded to, some common things we need to focus on is getting outside. So if you look at the subtleties of this picture, the person's starting not quite at the edge of the road, and they actually get the closest to the edge just before they start turning. Or a person might just set up in the gutter early and be riding that right curb or close to that right curb all the way. But you want to make sure you're staying as wide as possible until just before you start turning. We don't want to see is that you start wide, and like I mentioned a moment ago, you don't want to be creeping in, because you start making that turn radius available for you smaller and smaller, which means you can't go as fast. Or you just have less room to go around the turn at the same speed, and that becomes more dangerous. So keeping it wide is really key. One of the things, and I kind of just alluded to this, but some people don't wait long enough to turn, and so what they do is they're doing a great job of staying wide, but then they don't wait till up here to really initiate that turn. They start making that turn early. And so it's not that they're trying to sneak in early, it's just that they start a little bit early, and in effect the same thing happens. They start turning too early, and then they take a little bit of a straighter line as they come to the corner, and then you realize you've got a sharper turn to make as you're coming out. So key details about the racing line are staying out to the edge as you're setting up, waiting to actually start initiating that turn. And then as you turn, you can make a fairly sharp turn to begin with. And what you'll notice right here is the angle here is actually, they've kind of already turned more than 45 degrees. So if we've got to turn 90 degrees around this corner, they've already turned more than 45 degrees. And so on the exit of the turn, it gives them a lot more space to work with. Because if there's a crash, they're not turning as sharply as they exit the corner, and so it makes it possible to go inside. It can even make it possible to go outside, because you just kind of float out, and then it's going to be a little bit tight as you come around, but you may still have space available. And that's because you did did some sharper turning to start the turn, and so you set yourself up well, and then it gives you more flexibility as you exit the turn, which makes for smoother, faster turning, as well as safer, especially in the event that something unexpected is happening. So when you're looking at a line, how to approach your path for the corner, those are some key details. Some mechanics of getting around a corner. Sometimes we hear people really emphasizing where weight needs to be, how you lean, how you do a lot of these other things. And in certain situations that can be helpful, but the things to focus on most are just kind of the standard bike position. You want to have heads up, you want to have your head up and your eyes looking forward. Often we talk about 5 or 10 riders ahead is where you want to be looking. And in a corner, that means you're going to be looking through the corner. As you're entering the corner, you're actually going to be looking in the middle of the corner, even to the exit already. And as you're right in the middle of the corner at the apex, you're going to be looking at at where you're going to be almost straightening out again, exiting the corner. That helps you anticipate things coming up. And can take some practice to look ahead that much, but it's really helpful both to be able to corner safely and to corner quickly. I think in terms of body position, one of the most basic things is just having a relaxed grip on the bars, some flex in the elbows, and some relaxed shoulders. What that helps with as you go through the corner, you're able to absorb some of the vibrations that are going to happen on almost any sort of street or pavement, but especially if there are significant bumps. Keeping your wheels in contact with the road as you're doing that, as opposed to having them bounce, and you actually have your wheel bounce across the pavement or skip, and so you just have better traction as a result. And then hands in the drops is a really good practice, particularly in race situations. If you're just riding recreationally, that may not always be a necessity, but it is something I always encourage people practice. Have your bike fit so you can actually ride comfortably, in the drops. Learn to get comfortable. Some people haven't done it, and so they're not comfortable using the drops at all. But it definitely provides some safety when you're in a group. Helps get your weight a little bit lower. You can shift from that position if your bike's set up right, as well as brake, and so it provides a lot of options when you're coming into a corner, when you want to probably shift and brake. Some other cornering mechanics, pedals. And so especially in sharp corners, we need to make sure that our pedals are in the right place. So looking at this picture, you can see that the outside pedal is down for both of these riders. The back rider is hard to see their foot, but you can see that their inside foot is up. And that provides plenty of clearance, because if this pedal is down and you're turning sharply, you're actually likely to hit the ground. Call it clipping a pedal. And that can lead to a crash, because what happens when you hit a pedal is one or both of your wheels can lose contact with the ground momentarily, which can lead to sliding out. Doesn't always happen, but it freaks people out, and it's not a good thing. So especially in sharp corners, that's really important. If it's not a real sharp corner, though, pedaling through a corner can be a good idea. And this can take some experience and practice to learn what's too fast and what is fine for pedaling through. But by pedaling through a corner, even just lightly, you're going to maintain speed a lot better. That's going to mean you slow down less coming into the corner and through the corner. And so as you exit the corner, especially in race situations, then you're not going to have to accelerate nearly as hard. So you're going to save a lot of energy by doing that. And the other one is it's going to keep it smoother for everybody else behind. And so if a group's riding through the corner, person on the front is pedaling through the corner, the speed stays much more consistent, and everybody else can follow through the corner much more smoothly. Difference oftentimes between a beginner category race and, say, a Cat 3 race or Cat 1-2 race is that people ride through the corners much more smoothly, and so it's easier for the higher category riders to keep a higher speed, because they don't slow down nearly as much, save a lot of energy in the process, and going down the straightaways they can go faster. So obviously being on a higher category often involves having a higher level of fitness, but oftentimes a big part of that, the speed differential, is not just the fitness difference, but the fact that the skills are better, and that helps support the fact that the group can then go faster. So pedaling through a corner, learning when, practicing that, and honestly, learning cornering mechanics is something you have to practice in person. You can watch and you can learn some things, and it's good to have those in mind, but then you have to go do it. So if you have a chance to go do some cornering, especially in a place where you don't have to worry about traffic and you've got some good road conditions, those are fantastic skills to develop. Take advantage of that. So I already really I've talked about this one in terms of cornering mistakes, but starting too far in and not setting yourself up wide, because what happens then is the trajectory as you hit the apex is you haven't even gotten kind of halfway around the corner, and now you've got to tighten up that turn, and you start seeing the curb. If there's a crash, you don't have nearly as much wiggle room as you come through. Or you're just forced to hit the brakes and slow down because you're not going to make it around that turn. And so you end up going slower through the turn, and you have to accelerate a lot more, work a lot harder coming out of the corner. Another common cornering mistake, and this happens at a lot of levels of cycling too much, and so this is always a good one to point out, is with the purple rider's setting the line through the corner, and as long as they choose a pretty good path, as long as they're not doing something crazy where they're starting way too far inside, and sometimes you might recognize that and have to take a different line, but assume they're taking a good line through the corner. The blue rider is just following. It doesn't need to pick his own path, doesn't need to do anything different, doesn't really need to make a big decision about that. Just follow the rider in purple through the corner. What we see too often, though, is you'll have like this rider in red who, as they enter the corner, for whatever reason, starts changing lines, and instead of following the blue rider, they start making their own path that veers off to the outside. Which causes a couple of things to happen. One is if you're in a situation that's multiple wide and this person starts going out, we start causing questions about who's riding where. In the single rider situation, the green rider has to decide, do I follow red? Do I follow blue? But when we get in a multi-rider situation, and our rider in red is kind of veering off to the outside or changing lines, now you've got a whole bunch of riders who start having questions about which line they're supposed to take through the corner. And one of the things we really emphasize riding safely in a group is trying to be predictable, and that scenario makes things less predictable. So that's why we want to really encourage people maintain a line as you go through a corner. Typically, it's going to be faster for you. You know, it's rare that this person moves wide and suddenly they're moving up a lot. It can happen, but typically you want to, if you want to go around on the outside, you want to set that up before the corner, not in the middle of the corner. And so they actually start, this gap opens up and they lose space. They're not gaining space by changing that line. And you want to make it more predictable for the people behind. Our rider in green here, what they should be doing is looking up the road, 5-10 riders, anticipating what's happening, seeing the lines that people are choosing, and as a result, follow the group. So follow what the group is doing, not what this individual rider is doing right in front of them. And so the choice for the green rider, unless there's some danger that's happened, but the choice for the green rider should be follow the group, follow the path of the group or the majority of the riders, rather than that single rider. Now looking at riding multiple riders wide, bigger group, the road has enough space, maybe the pace is a little slower, whatever the situation is, you're riding a couple riders wide, nothing really changes. And as you come into the corner, you're going to be riding side by side like these two riders. The inside path is a little shorter, so you're going to notice that these two riders, they probably entered the corner right side by side, but because the path on the inside is a little shorter, they're going to exit the corner with the inside rider probably a little bit ahead. But how do we do this with a group? So as I said, you're going to enter the corner side by side. But the inside rider is typically the one who kind of sets the line, and the outside rider is just matching what the inside rider is doing. Now we're all in this together, and so in a normal situation, the rider we're just going to pretend that the rider in light blue here is leading the group, because then we can see the person right next to them. But they are going to set the line. They're going to leave plenty of space for the rider next to them. So as they come out of the exit, they're not going to be hitting the curb out here. They're leaving plenty of space for the rider next to them. Similarly, it's always good for this rider as they lead through the corner. If this is our inside curb here, leave a little bit of space here. So if things get a little hairy, somebody's got a little bit of space they can fit through. The goal is not to have somebody behind you pass you, but if something happens and they just need to put a tire in here, you're not taking them right into the curb. So as a lead rider, leave a little space on the inside, kind of as an out for people. You don't need to be just hitting the curb right on the inside and leaving no room. And then on the outside of the turn, make sure you are lining it up so the person on the outside is going to have plenty of space. And then that rider on the outside, their goal, all they have to do is just keep nice even spacing with the inside rider, and they're all set. Now the people behind, as long as the front two riders are doing what they need to do, the people behind, their job is super easy. They literally just pay attention to the person in front of them. So the yellow and purple, let's go back to them actually being our leaders at this point. Everybody just has to follow them. They've held a nice consistent speed. Our spacing between riders is consistent because the speed has been smooth. Nobody's accelerating hard, jamming on the brakes. They've approached the corner at a good pace. And so they are able to just ride real smoothly. They've kept good spacing side to side. And so the riders behind, their job is really easy because they're looking up the road and paying attention to what's happening, but everything's smooth and they just follow the rider in front of them. It's as easy as that. And as long as you're doing that, when you add that third row or even that fourth row, it doesn't become any more complicated. You just roll through the corner, following the rider in front of you. As things get faster, things get tighter, things can get a little bit more tense. There can be some more jockeying for position. But in those moments, this is the goal, is to keep the spacing really even between all the riders. the pace to be really smooth, and to hopefully just follow a nice smooth straight line. Because even then, in those competitive moments, at more elite levels of the sport, they're still practicing exactly the same thing. They're not trying to do some sort of scissor merge here in the middle of the corner, where there's not space really. Just holding nice and steady through the corner. So that's cornering. Whether you're doing it to single file or with multiple wide, you really just want to set yourself up. I'm going the wrong direction, but I just want to summarize that. You want to set yourself up for the corner with a good path through the corner, and then it makes it easy for other people to follow. Good position on the bike. You want to make sure that the inside pedal is up, and then avoid scooting in early on the corner. That's a really common one that we see. So just good to keep in mind and make sure we're not doing that. And don't be changing lines in the corner. If you really can just focus on following the path of the rider in front of you, things are going to go a lot more smoothly. All right, shifting focus to sprinting. The basics of this are the same. These should look familiar. The position on the bike is going to mimic what you've been doing previously. Only difference is you're going to be out of the saddle, but everything's going to be the same. You want to protect your front wheel. You want to be predictable, and you want to kind of keep perspective about being safe, being in it together. But the one thing that changes with sprinting is that it's typically at the end of the race. Everybody's anticipating the finish. They're going harder, and now finally they've let loose with that really hard max sprint effort, and nobody is smart when they are going hard. The reason it takes so much practice to sprint safely is because you're not thinking in those situations really very much. You are acting based upon your experience, and so you need to have habits that are based on safe practices. And you develop those habits by having done and practiced them a lot. So that's why sprinting is dangerous. Even at the elite level, they start adding new details in, and there's things to pay attention to, and they need to have more and more experience with those higher level skills. And then you got to react quickly, but nobody is thinking very well when they're going that hard, even at the pro level. Now, lots of the basics for them in the sprint situation have become habits. So there's less things they have to think about, and they can kind of react based upon all of their experience much better. But thinking is not something people do when you're going max. And this is why it's important to, when you think about the context of a sprint, the rules have not changed. The context has changed, but the rules are still the same in terms of what you should be doing. So head and eyes up. None of this aero sprint technique that we've seen in some recent years. People are actually starting to shift away from that a little bit. So everybody has not adopted this new super low sprint technique, but as you're learning how to do it, make sure your head's up and your eyes are looking forward, and you can see 5-10 riders in front of you. Even if you're the first rider on the road, make sure you can still see that far ahead. So keeping that relaxed upper body, whether you're sitting or standing, that should be the case. And then hands on the drops is actually an important one. If I jump over to kind of my chalkboard here, one of the things that can happen if you don't have hands on the drops, people aren't real smart when they're sprinting, we've talked about. And if you get right up here, let me zoom in on this. You get right up in here, you can actually hook handlebars. And by keeping your hands on the drops, however, you really block somebody from being able to get into that position. I recently watched an in-race video. They're kind of looking at a crash that happened in a race and talking about what could have prevented it. And it turned out that the rider who crashed was sprinting with their hands on the hoods. And had they had their hands on the drops, it would have been much less likely that they would have crashed, because they wouldn't have hooked handlebars, or the contact wouldn't have happened directly with the handlebar. It would have happened with their arm beforehand. And so that hand in the drops, particularly in a sprint situation, can really be an asset to your safety. So again, big proponent for encouraging people to really practice riding in the drops, sprinting in the drops, because it provides a number of benefits, from aerodynamics and brake and shifting access to safety. Now, oftentimes we talk about following the path of the rider in front of you, and that's what a straight line is. But when it comes to sprinting, it is actually good to think a little bit more about having lanes. people are always looking to advance their position in a sprint, and so people are going to be moving out. And you want to make sure this is gradual as you move out and advance past people. You don't want to make this sudden sharp movement out and then coming up. First of all, you're going to get a better draft if you do it that way. But second, and probably more importantly, it's safer. This other rider is also making a move at the same time. If it's smooth, they can follow. But if it's jerky, suddenly they've made a move, and anyway, it gets chaotic. But as you change lines, then you want to really focus on keeping a steady path, straight path as you go down the road. One thing that can happen in sprinting is, we talk about a straight line not necessarily being parallel to the road, but just being a straight path down the road. So let's say all these riders are setting up for the sprint. Let's maybe adjust back here. And the green rider leads it out and takes this path like this. This is a really steady, in fact, straight line. It is not parallel to the road, but they are not hooking. They're being super consistent. However, they are leading people toward the edge of the road. So this can be a professional maneuver, but that is not something that you want to do out of safety. So, because if this rider is also going at the same time, they're kind of forced to continue going this way. Maybe they're sneaking up, and they continue sneaking up on the side as we move up. So technically it's a straight line if you make that nice, smooth, gradual, continual movement from one side of the road to the other. But it is a little bit shady. I'd save that for the pros before you start worrying about that one. But I do want to point it out because as you're sprinting, straight down the road is really the best way to go, especially as you're just developing experience and trying to stay safe in that context of sprinting. All right, so talked about cornering and sprinting and some basics. If I go back to sprinting real briefly, kind of my last comment about sprinting is when we do some practice in person, we do talk about some of the mechanics of sprinting, and that can be really helpful for people who haven't done very much sprinting. And so we do a few drills there. But one of the things I really encourage all riders to do, if you're ever going to do any competitions and things like that, but also sometimes it's training. So even if you're riding recreationally or just doing some non-competitive or at least less competitive Fondo sorts of things, is practice sprinting occasionally. I typically do clinics that only about a third of the people ever practice sprinting. And so actually take some time, practice doing it occasionally. And because your goal may not be to win a race, your goal might be to beat the person that you're with. And so if you're going for 10th place in your age group and you're with 3 other people, if you win the sprint, you get 10th. If you don't, you get 12th. And so just by doing some sprint practice, one, you're going to develop better power, better speed, better technique. You're going to be able to judge distance to the finish a lot better. So it's really helpful if you're going to be in any sort of competitive situation to actually practice sprinting occasionally. All right, last topic I want to talk about is moving in the group. So lots of times we have looked at how we move in a pace line nice and when everything's organized. But when you get in a group, things start looking a lot less organized, and so the questions arise like, how do I move up? How do I drop back? How do I save energy? How do I maintain position? And so really all we're going to do is apply these same principles again. What's your position on the bike in terms of keeping safety? Making sure you protect your front wheel in all those different situations that can happen in a group. Be predictable. And in this situation, we want to introduce the idea of controlling your space. And we talk about being assertive rather than passive or aggressive. And one way to be predictable for others as well as to benefit yourself is to control your space. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And in order to do that, you do need to be assertive. You can't just let everything happen. So moving in a group, if you're going to move up in a group, there's a couple ways to do that. Go back to the chalkboard and we line these riders back up. they're cruising down the road, and maybe a gap opens. And let's imagine that this is our starting position. And a gap just starts opening up. Maybe the green riders loses focus or just not able to maintain pace. Now the rider in purple wants to move up. All they need to do is just move out smoothly. They don't want to make a sudden move to the side. It is the rider in blue's responsibility to not be half wheeling here, because if purple rider wants to move over, technically it's blue rider's fault if the wheels touch. But if purple rider is moving smoothly, even if blue rider is not in good position, if purple rider starts moving and doesn't realize they're there, they can move smoothly through there. Blue has enough time to react, or there's just enough space if purple is moving smoothly. But if you want to move up, it's really just a matter of smoothly move around this rider and then pull back in. Green rider can help out by communicating and just saying you're clear, or it's open, and that will let the purple rider know that they can kind of smoothly come back in. And that helps out both riders. One, purple knows they can come back in and start getting the draft again. But two, it gives a wheel that the green rider can now follow. So maybe purple rider is just pulled in front and now can get towed back up just a little bit. Purple's in the draft in the line. Green didn't lose contact. Blue rider should be paying attention up the road and not have just sat back here. When the purple rider started making this move, blue should have said, hey, I'm going to follow that train. And maybe they go all the way around, or maybe purple goes all the way around and blue just goes up to green rider. But by paying attention, looking up the road, rider and blue can see what's happening and not get left behind in that gap either. So single file, pretty easy to move up. If you're dropping back, generally we talk about dropping back and just getting on the back if you're in a small group. If you're in a big group, things are quite a bit different. Let's say this group's going pretty fast, and so they're a bit bunched up, but there's still a rider on the front. Everybody else kind of hanging here, and rider in pink says, "Yeah, I'm done here." So they're gonna signal that they're coming off, and what they may actually do is slide off here and slow down, and this is gonna force the rider in kind of blue, peach, and red to slow down, and for the aqua jersey rider to take over, and maybe these riders follow them back. That's one scenario that can happen. Another scenario that can happen with that person on the front is that pink goes to pull off, and they may just pull all the way out here. Hopefully this is a closed road if you're going over the yellow line, but they're going to drift back and paying attention to what's going on back here so that they can jump on right there rather than getting spit out the back because they weren't paying attention. And they may, for whatever reason, wind direction or anything else, decide they want to go around all the way back here, or even go tuck in on that side. That's fine, but they can float back. Now, sometimes you don't want to be going all the way to the back when this happens. So you're pulling off. You don't want to be front wheel, but you don't want to have to go all the way to the back. In that case, it can be good to just kind of slow down and these riders float back with you. And then this rider may pull up a little bit, and what rider in pink may ultimately want to do is essentially, and this is where being assertive, not passive and just letting stuff happen, because otherwise you might end up dropping all the way to the back. But as some of this reshuffling happens, you're paying attention, and now you're sliding in here, and you may point or signal, and the green rider's probably going to let this rider in. I mean, unless it's the end of the race and everybody's fighting for position. Green rider's like, they just want to slide in. They're on the front. They're probably a strong rider. No skin off my back. I'm not worried about a spot or two in my position. I'm really just sitting in. And in fact, I get tucked in. These other riders might pull up alongside, and rider in light green has a great draft. So this is where you got to be assertive to make some of these things happen. Rider in the aqua jersey, same thing. They were dropping off, and again, these riders may go back with them. Some of these riders may be advancing. Maybe this line is pulling up here, and really what you're doing is just looking for a little hole. So maybe blue starts coming up, and pink says, oh no, I want that spot, and so they're drifting back just a little bit. And green may, again, be more than happy to let somebody in. So sometimes it's a matter of paying attention to what's going on in the group. And you may find, oh, hey, there's a rider. They're happy to just be there, but they don't necessarily want to be moving forward. They're happy to let you in. They may also be sitting on not doing any work, and that's a different situation. But you also may know there are some good spots to slide into. So don't feel like, reset here. If you're this rider, I'm trying to set this up again so we have a similar scenario. So if you're this rider in blue, don't feel like you have to go all the way to the back. Kind of slot yourself in next to some other people, wait for a little opening, and then slide in there. And again, you want to make that a gradual movement because people behind you may have to open up. And in a lot of scenarios, they're happy to open up because they can just follow your wheel and they're going to get the draft. So that's moving up, moving back, and how you do that within a group. Now, one of the things that also happens there is you need to control your space around you. So maybe it is getting toward the end of the race and you are not interested in giving up spots. And so the rider in pink is like, I'm done. I'm pulling off. Now this group may be leading through. And so they're coming up a bit faster. And they're going to be creeping by. And red is kind of pushing all these riders back. And these riders may say, hey, we're not interested in this at all. Because they're losing positions. But pink is tired and it's like, I need to find a spot. Now, at this point, the riders in green, light green, may have no interest in giving somebody a space. So the way that they control that space is twofold. One is staying close to the rider in front of them. Two is making sure their handlebars are at least even with somebody. Because if this rider is floating right here, what they might be trying to do is force this person to back off. They're not really forcing them to do it, but they're kind of encouraging them to back off so they can slide in there. And so instead of this light green rider sitting back here, if they pull up their handlebars even or even just a little bit in front, it's a clear signal to rider in the pink jersey that they're not going to be able to get in there. And so then they're back here. Now, if they want to get in, they need to kind of start buttoning themselves in there. Now, you'll notice, maybe you saw that from a distance, maybe not, but we've got an overlapping wheel scenario here. And this is something you're not real excited about having for a long period of time. And so you got to be heads up in this situation. Usually these are not situations people hang out in forever. You know, you're trying to get a spot, trying to force a little bit of space. And this rider in light green says, oh, okay, I'll let you in. And so then everybody's got to do a little bit of shuffling so that the rider in pink can get back in. But one of the other things that happened is rider in pink was moving here. Everybody started coming around. But rider in pink is then able to slide back in this spot. If these riders don't want that to happen, they need to close this up. And what they're doing is controlling the space around them because now there's only one place for the rider in pink to go. They don't have this option to like slip back through the group. This is like a nice way to slip back through the group because you're pretty much in the draft, even though there's not somebody directly in front of you. The group is big enough. It creates a bit of a bubble on the front is really how the aerodynamics of that work. And so they're actually getting a decent draft right in here. But if these riders don't want to be losing position, they need to hug this other line of riders much more closely. So that's not an option for them to drop back that way. And then this person is stuck out here. And approaching the finish of a race, these riders don't want to necessarily give this rider a break. So maybe they have to go all the way to the back. Now, if they've got enough time and people aren't being too assertive, or just being assertive if they're not being assertive enough, rider in pink may be able to move up through the group. So these riders, you know, there's always a little bit of wiggling and moving and things that's happening in the group. Well, it might happen that rider in purple opens up a gap. Pink decides to slide up in here. They want to make sure, as they do this, that I'm going to zoom in a little bit, that they pull up even. If they're sitting back here, it's pretty easy for purple to take their spot back. But if pink rides up, at this point, you know, they've essentially passed the rider in purple. And so the purple rider is probably going to end up slipping back and saying, oh, you know, I lost my spot. And people are riding around. There's always a little bit of of movement in the group. And suddenly pink sees some more space, and they just ride up in this gap here. And again, they want to pull up even with both of these riders, because what you're trying to do is get somebody, and this is kind of like training your dog, or with the dominant submissive sort of thing. You want to get in the dominant controlling position, and then oftentimes that person will say, okay, you win this positioning. They get that. And so the rider in pink, by doing this, moving up through the group, it's not a fast way to get to the front, but it uses very little energy. And so all you're doing is looking for these little holes to open up, being assertive, moving up in here, getting your handlebars even with that person. Rider in green says, oh, okay. This rider in light green might not even want to be all the way at front, so they might be happy to let the rider in pink move into that position. They want to be near the front, but they don't want to be on the front. But the rider in pink has been able to stay totally in the draft using probably only 50-ish%. Oftentimes they say you save 50, 60% sometimes in the middle of the group. And so they've been able to save all that energy and still move back up through the group. So they're getting a fair amount of rest, but they're able to manage their position in the group. And that is really how you do that. And if you're trying to prevent that, the way to do it and control your position is to tighten things up. And so you're not leaving enough space for other riders to come in and take your spot. If there is watch the Tour de France when that happens this year, or go back and watch some replays or other big races, other Grand Tours. But you get the sprint train going, particularly in those Grand Tours on the sprint stages. Let's imagine these riders are all the same. Sometimes we see these trains go, kind of take their own totally independent line. Well, that allows somebody without a big team, but might be a good sprinter, to follow that group real easily. They might not be able to integrate super easily into the middle of that line, but they can actually follow it super easily. Whereas if this team is really trying to control who can do what, sometimes they actually want to tuck in tightly on the side of the group, so that as they work together, the four of them can stay nice and tight, but they don't have other people who can just jump on super easily, because essentially they've not left a gap in between these two lines where people can start sliding in and things like that. So managing the space right and left with relation to other people can help you maintain position, but it also helps keep things a bit more predictable. So that's controlling your space and also being predictable in some of those situations. Another way to be predictable in these situations is just making sure you're keeping a steady speed. Sometimes you'll see some riders, instead of touching their brakes, they'll pull out to the side a little bit and soft pedal for a moment, or just coast and control their speed that way. And that's why, if you're the rider here in light blue, or the rider in kind of the pink or peach color, if you're looking ahead at the front rider, even looking at further up the road in front, if a rider's swinging out here, you may know, they're just controlling their speed. So you're not trying to move in and take their spot. That in a moment they're going to slow down and soft pedal back into that spot. If you're in the middle of the field, that's a little harder to do. Sometimes you'll see riders sitting up and catching a little bit extra wind resistance, and that makes it so they're not hitting their brakes. You can hit your brakes softly and try and modulate, but at the same time, it's still pretty easy to over brake, and then you're slowing down, and then people behind you are slowing down, and suddenly you've got gaps forming, and then somebody's slotting in here. And so lots of times as people get more experience, they're trying to be predictable, they're trying to manage their speed as they're inside the group as much as possible. That helps control their space in the group. It helps be predictable for other people. And so just a little bit of insight in terms of how a few of those different factors go. Last detail I'm going to talk about is not anything new, but really an opportunity to apply all this. And this is a video that I saw recently that does a good job at looking, showing a few examples of positioning in a group, and talking about positioning coming into a sprint, how you save energy, how you take advantage of some things. And it's really, they point out some things that should happen or could happen in a group, but maybe unfortunately for the rider who's the subject of the video, they missed out on a lot of good opportunities. So I want to show you just real briefly what this looks like. And so I'm going to go back a little bit. So they're going to cut scenes here, and you're going to see the person coming into the corner. One of the things we want to keep in mind as we're coming through the corner, keeping steady spacing, holding your line. And we're going to see that kind of fall apart. So right here, we switch scenes, and at first, our rider, where we're seeing the camera from, is following this rider in the black and blue on the yellow bike. And there's kind of an empty line right here. There's a white rider with a white jersey, and there's a line behind him that's open. And then there's a third line here to the outside. But what we see happen is our rider with the camera floats outside, just went across two lines. So from this rider's wheel to this rider's wheel, or to this line to this outer line. And you'll notice they went from being almost on the rider on the yellow bike's wheel to they come out of this corner and they have just lost 2-3 bike lengths and crossed over two separate lines. So they're on their third line going through the corner. And now they got to make a big effort and then come back over two lines and move back up into position. Now, had they set themselves up for that corner better, you come into this corner, you just follow this rider in front of you. If you follow the rider on the yellow bike coming through the corner, they would be less than a bike length behind them exiting the corner. They would not have to make nearly as big of an effort. If you watch the power in there, they go from coasting right here to as they come out of the corner doing 7,800 watts. So they used a lot of energy to get there. We're going to scroll forward here just a little bit because there is a good example of seeing where a person can advance in the group. I think it's... Oh, pardon me while I find this real quickly. But here we go. There's a spot. You're looking up the road. And if you are looking 5-10 riders ahead, you should really quickly recognize that as this pace line moves over, and people are following the draft of the person in front of them. But what you should see appear is this just spread out at the front, and that's a classic sign that things are slowing down up there. And if you're watching ahead, this person can go from doing 600 watts right here, big effort. And right now they're probably they touched the brakes. If you saw real quickly, their fingers popped out. They actually touch the brakes. Now watch what happens on their left side. And there goes a rider. Coasting right past them. So if this rider had been paying attention a little bit more, would have recognized this clear sign that things are slowing down, riding at a very, very low intensity. They could have, even possibly coasting, they could have done exactly the same thing and with zero energy moved up in a race. So there's some more examples in this video, and it's a really good one. And so I definitely encourage people take a look at that video. Get out of the full screen, back to our presentation. But yeah, check that one out because it's a good example of all sorts of things that you could do that rider didn't do. They've got great sprint power, but being out of position hurt them a lot. And it really talks to taking advantage of opportunities to move up, looking for those, anticipating those, holding your line through corners and just cornering efficiently, and is really a good application of a lot of things that we've seen. If we were in person, we do a practice race, and you get to test a lot of these things. We talk about pinning numbers, start line instructions, safety instructions at the beginning of a race. But what I want to focus on is practice riding with others. We don't have the practice races right now, and as pandemic ends, we'll take advantage of that. But if you get a chance to ride with others, do that. Actually ride with them. If you're strong enough to break away, spend a lot of time still riding with others. If you get dropped from a group, there's probably somebody else who's getting dropped too. Look for them and work at riding together, because it becomes an opportunity to practice and develop your skills, so that you can improve. Last thing we always say during practice races is always at the finish line, continue riding through the finish line. So never stop right at the finish line. You don't want to become road furniture that other people are starting to dodge. But as I was mentioning with the video, and taking any opportunity to practice. Those are great ways to develop your skill set, increase experience, improve your skills, make some of those things habits. I'm a huge advocate of visualization, and so some of that is just, it takes very little time, very little energy, but you can really kind of put yourself in the shoes of a lot of different situations. And then when you actually find yourself in that situation, be it in a group ride or in a race, you have a little bit better idea what to do. And watching videos is one great way to start that process. What would I do? What do I see happening? How can I apply some of these things that we've talked about here, as well as some of the things you're learning through a number of videos that are available online, to be able to practice some of these skills better. But it takes a lot of practice, and that's why I talk about visualization and taking opportunities, because don't anticipate that you're going to do everything perfectly the first or second or third time. Try and take what we've talked about here and go practice in the real world, recognizing it's going to be a process of learning and improving as you go along. Hope these have been helpful. If you have questions or comments, feel free to drop those to me directly at Develop Coaching. Just look me up online. You can contact me through there, or even comments online. And otherwise, best of luck as you get opportunities to get out on the road and ride with others.